All right, why don't we get started? Hi again. My name is Stefanos Geroulanos. I welcome to the last session for today. I'm the director of the Remark Institute. And I get to introduce our speakers and to begin our discussion at the end of things. This panel blends historical sociology and intellectual history, a subject that is quite dear to me. Not least because with Giselle, we spent 6 years organizing a project funded by the Partner University Fund that resulted in this Routledge Handbook on the History and Sociology of Ideas. And it's particularly dear to me also because many of the subjects that have been brought up today are precisely within the vein that we imagined. Already from your talk yesterday and through the morning panel today that concentrated so much on questions of, let's say, historical sociology and linked to literature and even to emotions within literature, relations of friendship and so on. This was very close to what we had in mind. In our introduction to that book, Giselle and I argued that the disciplinary divergence between intellectual history and sociology is uncalled for methodologically, and that it significantly hampers the history and sociology of ideas as distinct, semi-distinct fields in their respective attempts to pursue new fields, new domains, new realms of inquiry. And we accordingly worked to bridge field theory, which is such force for delimiting objects of study and for analyzing how ideas and concepts circulate and are retranslated across national and disciplinary domains, with new approaches in historical epistemology and in conceptual history that seek to go beyond traditional contextualism and traditional Begriffsgeschichte, especially in paying greater attention to the webbed interrelationships of concepts and their transnational and translation-oriented forms. Now, we have 3 speakers today. The first of whom was involved in that project. This is Johan Heilbron, professor of sociology at the University of Amsterdam and a guest professor at the Center for Higher Education and Research as Objects of Study, which sounds clunky until you understand that it has the coolest acronym ever, HERO. And the Department of History of Science and Ideas at Uppsala University in Sweden. He was also director of research at the CNRN, and he has been and continues to be a member of the Centre Européen de Sociologie et de Sciences Politiques at CNRS and HSS. Johan is best known in this country for his The Rise of Social Theory from 1995, Transnational Cultural Exchange and Globalization from 2010, and especially for French sociology from 2015. He has co-authored and co-edited several works, including the Dictionnaire International Bourdieu, and where did I lose it? Also Pierre Bourdieu et l'art de l'invention scientifique, which was co-authored in 2022. His talk will be called Intellectual History as Historical Sociology, well, Intellectual History as Historical Sociology, question mark. Somehow I thought that I could pull it off. So second will go Stephanie Mudge, who is Associate Professor of Sociology and Chancellor's Fellow at the University of California, Davis, and also the author of Leftism Reinvented, Western Parties from Socialism to Neoliberalism. Leftism Reinvented won several awards and is, to my mind, an exemplary book, an immensely important book in understanding a supremely influential transnational development and phenomenon, namely the turn of left-wing parties toward the center and their increased reliance on experts and expertise toward the end of the last century, specifically the German and Swedish Social Democrats, the Democrats in the US, and the British Labour Party. She shows there how the need to win elections in each case came to trump traditional priorities, notably the representation of the working class. Stephanie is also the series co-editor with Anthony Chen of Cambridge Studies in Historical Sociology, and her talk will be titled The Transnational Historical Sociology of Commodified Democracy, a Field Approach. And last but not least will be Gil Eyal, professor of sociology at Columbia, who is a sociologist of expertise and elites. His books include The Crisis of Expertise, which focuses on expertise and mistrust from 2019, The Autism Matrix, The Social Origins of the Autism Epidemic from 2013, The Disenchantment of the Orient, Expertise in Arab Affairs in the Israeli States from 2008, The Origins of Post-Communist Elites, 2003, and he's also the co-author of Making Capitalism Without Capitalists from 1999. So kind of like one of the best titles ever.
Not mine.
His talk is titled Trusting as a Skillful Act, Thinking with Pierre Bourdieu's Analysis of le Sens Pratique to Reconstruct the Sociological Theory of Trust. And we'll go with Johan first and then Stephanie behind me here. So I'm going to try and keep you to 20, 25 minutes and we'll see how we.
Okay, I'll do my best. Thanks a lot, Stefanos, and the other organizers of the conference as well for putting together this event, which is a rare occasion, in fact, for these kind of exchanges that we've been having. It's very rare that we can talk to people from different disciplines and research fields, and yet have sufficient in common to be interested in what the others say, bring up. So many thanks for that. Yeah, my talk is about the relations between intellectual history and historical sociology. Question mark got lost, but in the title there was a question mark. If we first start to historicize this question of relations between intellectual history and historical sociology, and I will take as my case the writings about the history of the social sciences and humanities. That will be the case that I will use those kind of reflection about the relationship between these two endeavors. If we immediately start to historicize the question of intellectual history and historical sociology, and take this example of historical work on the social sciences, I think we can observe in the past half century, broad shift from very quickly, presentism to historicism. And this title immediately, this qualification immediately echoes an influential article by George Stocking, historian of anthropology, in one of the very first issues of the first specialized journal on the history of the social behavioral sciences, argues that we should break with presentism and we should adopt a historicist position. His main reference in these terms is Butterfield, who distinguishes between history writing for the sake of the present, some present cause, and history writing, understanding the past for the sake of the past. Butterfield and Stocking takes this over from him. Now, what happened very quickly after, I think, these first articles in the late 60s is that a sort of historicist revolt, historicist movement took on against presentism and the biases of presentism. Especially after 1968, May 68, the university in the 1970s, the critique of presentism was broadened. And so it was understood variously as a legitimation of the scientific status quo. You know, this was a history of winners, mainly dead white males. One of the qualifications I remember from a conference then was idealist conceptions of science. Merton's norms were a little bit, didn't hold up very well to the realities of scientific work. There was the work of Sarton and other historians of science who presented development of the science and development of progress. There was a general denial of social exclusion, power structure. And on a slightly more technical, perhaps, aspect is that this was a critique of anachronisms, quick histories of tunnel visions on development of science, use of teleological schemes, etc., and a plea for a proper historical understanding of scholarly work, scientific work, and so forth, which means that you have to reconstruct meaning in time, do archival work, which the presentist account history of the social sciences do in fact barely any serious historical research on archives or so. And in fact, this movement was fairly successful because it produced a whole range of new journals. Here are some of the general journals, like the first one being the Journal of the History of the Behavioral Sciences, 65, and it was followed by others, History of the Human Sciences, a British initiative, Revue d'Histoire des Sciences Humaines is a French journal. Serendipities is more recent. It was launched by Austrian sociologists, had a specific profile as well. And more recently, History of the Humanities, which was a Dutch-based initiatives, in fact. And most recently, History of Social Science, which is a new journal which will appear, I think, at the end of the year, as far as I know. So there are these general journals on the history of the social and sciences and humanities, each with a specific profile. You should look more carefully at it, of course. And besides that, there was a host of disciplinary journals, history of economic ideas, history of psychology, etc., etc. This is a small list. Now, I think you can say that historicism was a kind of common posture in this movement, but in fact, it's a kind of bipolar space. There is, on the one hand, new disciplinary history related to the disciplines, often to the canon of the disciplines, canonical figures that are re-examined, related to internal debates and to teaching programs. And some disciplines are teaching programs. History of economic ideas is an economics department, is part of the curriculum. So this is very schematically, of course, but I think you can say this is history writing, historicist history writing, breaking with the presentist, but by a certain extent for practitioners of these very disciplines in their department. And then the other pose is new intellectual history, which came out of the older history of ideas, which originated in philosophy, and it sort of moved to historians and to Skinner, Koselleck, Pocock. These are eminent representatives of historical discipline working in departments of history. Perhaps there's a third pole, but it's much smaller. History of science, people who are coming out of history of science that have taken on work about the social sciences and humanities. Now, I think I would say that the current situation, there is a need to move beyond historicism. And it would imply, I think, two things. One is to rethink this opposition between historicism and presentism. There's structured quite a bit of work which is been done in the past decades. And a second way, I think, to move beyond historicism as it has been practiced is to be more involve more systematic engagement with sociology, logical approaches, because the heuristic potential of sociology for new understanding of history, scholarly disciplines, and so on, is underdeveloped. Now, the opposition, this structuring opposition between presentism and historicism, there is, I think, the question, why do you study the past? Why is it interesting to study history of social science, and so forth? There is a tendency for, I think you could say, that retreat into sort of historical erudition. The disciplinary journals, for example, it's quite clear that there's very rich amount of work on the history of these disciplines. But the presentist question, namely, why do we do this? Why should we be interested in the history of disease? Has been a kind of taboo, has been a tendency to accept rather routinely without interrogation. That of course it is interesting to study this archive of publish this kind of letters and so on. So there are these Durkheimology, for example, this whole specialized tradition about Durkheim is not always clear why this should be of interest. This is the presentist question. And instead of exercising the present, I think it's much better, much more interesting to objectivate the present, to reflect on scholarly and civic stakes of the work we do, and to discuss these explicitly collective. So maybe you can say there's a need for a sort of reflexive presentism, which would be a presentism that instead of rejecting the present, you reflect on it and say, what does our work in the present, could it mean? What are the danger, the possible biases that bring presentism? So we can accept, I think, the historicist critiques presentism without giving up kind of engagement with, without the necessity to raise these questions. So this is a first question in which I think we have to go beyond current state of affairs. And the second question is then how do you study the past? Well, the traditional modes of, there are four traditional modes of understanding, you could say. The first opposition is internalist, externalist, classical way, difference in studying text or intellectuals. And there's a second opposition between intellectual and collective. So then you have four modes of understanding. You have the internalist individual modes of understanding is centers around intratextuality, a close reading basically. So you have Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations. There's a whole literature about this big book, very close and subtle readings of what the book is about. Or you have the oeuvre of Adam Smith, and then you have questions like, is Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations, compatible with Adam Smith of the theory of moral sentiments? Fiction, internalist individual. Internalist collective is about intertextuality. So you have what the Cambridge School, they call languages, reconstruct languages, particular conception of intertextuality, or you reconstruct conceptual lineages, which is German Begriffsgeschichte. The externalist individual perspective is the work is a function of the biography of the authors. Along those lines, or the collective externalist is where work is considered a function of a particular group, class, gender, or on the macro scale, modernity, for example. In the German program, there is some of this conceptual history. There's a relationship between sort of intertextual understanding of Begriffsgeschichte and kind of macro perspective, although it's a fairly loose connection with the critique of modernity. Now, I think if any one of these modes of understanding is not very satisfactory, I won't go into the reasons for that because I think we need an alternative framework, and the alternative framework should, I think, be based on two principles. One is to keep the products, ideas, methods, whatever they are, intellectual products, together with the producers who produce these products and the conditions of production under which they actually, that would be a first principle. If you don't accept the principle, then I think you fall back on one of the four conventional modes of understanding. So I think we have good reasons to accept this principle. The second principle would be the need to go beyond description and interpretation. This relates to sociology and the social sciences generally, and integrate more explicitly than in some work, explanatory questions. So you can describe and you can interpret Adam Smith, but then sooner or later you have to face the explanatory question. How can we explain Smith and these conditions and writes this work and so forth? So an alternative framework for the more traditional ones should be based, I think, on these two principles. Now, the good news is that Bourdieu's field theory fulfills these. I know this is unexpected. But Bourdieu if you reduce Bourdieu to kind of intellectual formula, you say intellectual production results from position takings based on a particular position in a specific relatively autonomous field and the forms of capital associated with his position, modulated by the dispositions of shorthand for books about this. But I mean, you can say that. And leading hypothesis is this idea of homology. That there is a homology between the space of position takings and the space of dispositions and positions of the age. And this is a sort of structural principle. And if you want to investigate, examine individual work from this perspective, then you have what is derived from this general approach, is that individual work is the encounter of agents defined by specific resources and dispositions with a field that to them is a space of possibles, space of possible opportunity structure. And this is what you find in these various books. I mean, Homo Academicus is about the university field in 68. There's the Heidegger book, individual case. The Rules of Art is about Flaubert and the literary field in the 19th century. Manet is equivalent for the artistic field. Science of Science is about the scientific field and how this approach can be used for understanding the scientific practices as well. For example, there in the scientific book, their book on the scientific field, there's this example of two physicists. And from this, the interesting aspect of this example, that these two physicists, they have almost all the characteristics in common. They're in the same field, same time, both male, the same amount of scientific capital. They were trained in physics and so on. And they were both recognized by obtaining at the end of their career a Nobel Prize in Physics. So this seems all the same, except then that there were a different social origin, so a different set of dispositions. So one was a middle-class physicist who went into one of the most central domains in physics at the time, namely quantum mechanics. And the other, this was Cohen Tanuji, and the other physicist, Pierre who was an aristocrat, had a much larger distance from the field. He didn't depend the same way on his success inside. So he could take liberties and risks that were far more difficult to accept for Tanuji. And so it's an interesting case where everything in the formula is the same except one dimension, and then you see how this plays out in the kind of work they do, and the fact that Gilles de Gennes chose a very risky area in physics to work on. He succeeded just as well. I mean, if you follow this, roughly this formula, that intellectual production results from position takings, etc., one part of the equation is intellectual production. So what is intellectual production? That of course, then we have to encounter again these sort of internalist questions, the tools of internalist analysis. There are very different ones. I mean, there's close reading, there's distant reading, conceptual history, various forms of intertextual understanding, quantitative methods. I think you could say from a perspective, a field theoretical perspective, that in principle, none of these internalist procedures taken as tools of understanding the intellectual production is in principle incompatible with field analysis. But qualifying, so not all the assumptions are equally acceptable. For example, conceptual history is I think, very important kind of historical understanding. But in the German tradition, there are elements, internal elements, lacking that are important if you deal with scholarly work. For example, it's not just about concepts, it's also, if you talk about scholarly work, about models, theoretical models, about methods. This tends to be very marginalized in Hilfsgeschichte. So we can accept, and it's even very important and fruitful to engage with conceptual history, but we should be attentive to the kind of assumptions that are perhaps I think if you look at it from a historical sociology perspective to questions of intellectual history, there are two features, Bourdieusian approach, which are central. Field theory, of course, is one component. Field theory, in fact, is a systematic account of the interdependence of intellectual products, intellectual producers, and conditions of production. It's a theoretical model. It's not the only model. There are others. It's an intellectual model to do exactly in a systematic manner account for this interdependence. And there's a second element which is important, reflexivity. One of the first formulae Bourdieu used in craft of sociology, scholars should know what they are doing. Quote, linguist Saussure said that the linguist should know what he or she is doing. And it's a sort of shorthand to describe this. A more elaborate formulation is to say that you have to historicize the subject of historization and objective the subject of formula, which is he uses kinds of science, reflexivity, I think. And he has elaborated this in Pascalian Meditations, where he says, yeah, this reflexive practice, kinds of humanities or whatever scholarly discipline there is, doing that reflexively instead of static manner or implies that you have to account for three dimensions. Relationship to the object. First one is the position the scholars have in social space. Class position, there's a gender aspect. Second dimension is peculiarities and especially the doxa of the field in which scholars work. And there's a third dimension to the reflexivity, namely the fact that these fields in which scholarly work is done are scholastic. Peculiarity of being in the scholastic field, exposed to scholastic biases. A lot of work on this, and his theory of practice is a way to deal, to break with main forms of scholastic. So I think these two issues, when you reflect on intellectual history from a sort of Bourdieusian historical sociology perspective, these are two main features, two main assets also that are central to in any program.
Impressive. Right. I'm going to get right into it because I probably have more to say than can be said easily in 20 minutes. First thing I want to note is that I've changed the title of my talk. I've changed it from commodified to uprooted. And obviously, this is a reference to Bourdieu and Sayad's uprooting on the forced resettlement of Algerian farmers during the war between French colonial regime and Algerian nationalists between 1905 and 1962. The project I'll speak about today is not about colonialism. It is about the origins and trajectory of political consultancy as a US and American global profession and its effects in and across national democratic fields in the past 3 decades or so. That is since the 1990s years of the third waves in Western central politics. A core theme of my comments today is that Bourdieu and Sayad's term uprooting offers a way of thinking about neoliberal and post-neoliberal politics in general, and the trajectory and effects of political consultancy specifically that moves beyond the fraught concept of embeddedness or disembeddedness on which the new or now not so new economic sociology was built via a problematically ahistorical reading of Karl Polanyi's Great Transformation. So that is where we'll end up. Believe it or not, I will start by situating my work a little more, hopefully to start making more sense. So my mobilization of Bourdieu's thought in my work has always been attuned to problems of knowledge, representation, economy, and Western democracies. The book, this project on consultants is motivated by sort of where my 2018 book ends up. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more shortly. And it's also informed by some work I've done with my collaborator, Antoine Gaucher, on European integration, expert professionals, and recently published a series of articles on the socio-historical formation of the European Central Bank. So what I'm talking about today is motivated by both of these other engagements and is sort of a two-part historical sociology of the relationship between financial capitalism and democratic representation. When it looks back to 19th and early 20th century American political formation on the one hand, the other on the contemporary moment. And the contemporary piece focuses on a historical figure that I call a strategist, by which I mean a vocational political consultant who lives off politics, in Max Weber's words, but not in the way that Weber meant. Strategists are specialists in the art of winning, not in order to take over state power, but as a means to professional distinction in the world of political consultancy. Let me ground that a little more, in particular in relationship to my the analysis in my 2018 book. That book began with an article that used the concept of field to try and disentangle and rethink the fraught concept or category of neoliberalism. And then in my book, I developed a field theoretical reworking of the Gramscian concept of the political party that shifts his categorical conceptualization of types of actors inside political parties, the masses, the leaders, and the intellectuals, into a relational conception of action orientations within party networks. So the idea here is to think and conceptualize, particularly in the case of the analysis of my book, which, as was mentioned, dealt with Labour Party, Swedish and German social democratic parties, and the American Democratic Party, and to conceptualize, to engage with the transformations in central left politics over the long period from up until the third wave period of the 1990s, by sort of party networks as being as consisting of this competing set of action orientations. That has to do with the necessities of political parties, where the task is they're oriented both power seeking or strategic office seeking. They're oriented toward representation, to speaking for represented groups, and to truth claiming, making authoritative claims about the state of the world and specifically about the economic world. So in the book, from this basic conception of the party, I focused on the figure of the party expert. And so my entry into figuring out why you get historical transformations and the way that left parties spoke was to analyze historically and comparatively the trajectories, social locations, and professional ethics of party experts. That is, recognized bearers of authoritative truth claims in party networks, specifically economic truth claims, as a means of understanding the transformations from socialism to Keynesianism and then to neoliberalism. So in the book, I track the shifting socio-historical locations of dominant party experts over time in an endeavor to account for changes over time in conceptions, parties' conceptions of the political world, the economic world, their role in it. I don't have time here to present the whole book. What I'll do for now is emphasize how it leads or motivates my current project on political consultants. So I'm gonna skip early part of the book, which deals with socialist politics and move forward to the 1960s, which is a time period that I describe as being one dominated by figures I call an economist theoretician. Refers to people like Karl Schiller in West Germany and Walter Heller in the United States. Economists, trained economists whose defining feature was a hybrid social location, professional ethic that expressed it. The economist theoreticians saw their role in party governments in terms of the necessity of adapting economic analysis and advice to the strategic requirements of government and representative politics, which meant, among other things, taking into account the demands and interests of working class constituencies and organized labor. So that's the general way that I think about the economist theoretician, the 1960s. By contrast, I trace in the book the emergence of a different kind of economist in center-left party networks in the 1980s and 1990s. TFE is a mouthful. It stands for Transnational Finance-Oriented Economist. And here in the book, I look at figures like Larry Summers, the United States, Ed Balls in the United Kingdom, very different kind of figures, mainly PhD holding economists, not always, but with backgrounds in monetary and financial economics, central banks, and international financial institutions, who, in ways that express their distinctive social locations, gave proscriptive advice to party elites, to center-left party elites, aimed at limiting discretion in service of the interests of markets. In other words, the TFE's professional ethics hinged on a commitment to promoting, serving, and sometimes saving the market. What I realized as I developed the book was that I had to account for the TFE, the connection between the TFE, a particular kind of expert, and a different kind of expert. Oh, sorry, I have the market in there. This is the problem when you do animations and don't practice enough. Okay, so what I realized as I developed the account was that the TFE had was flanked by a different kind of expert who came to be colloquially known in the 1990s as the spin doctor, or the figure I call the strategist. Again, a historically specific kind of party expert, specialized in the art of winning for its own sake or for the sake of their own professional advancement. And so I answered the question of why you find these two figures kind of co-occurring with an argument that mobilizes Weber's logic of elective affinity. And the argument was that third waism's market-oriented turn, in which the TFE was pivotal, created a strategic problem for center-left parties. Party elites seeking to sell unpopular policies in a time of diminishing turnouts and ever narrower electoral margins handled the problem by turning to strategic experts skilled in the art of spin, helping them to eke out short-term electoral wins by trying to make otherwise unpopular messages appealing to their historical working class constituencies. So importantly, the strategist of the 1980s and the early 2000s was historically unique with respect to all of the other figures that I've talked about so far. Unlike economist theoreticians who were hybrid experts with one foot in academic economics and the other in left parties, they were unlike the TFE. Were not spokespersons and representatives of the market. The strategist's status as a political expert is grounded in the public relations consulting industry, which is in turn part of an emergent terrain of corporate multinationals and an extremely lucrative global industry. Realize that bar chart is really small, bear with me. So I think about this as a kind of tilt in the makeup of party political elite networks, more broadly in the sort of logic and operations of democratic politics. In the case of center-left parties, an anchoring, a site of anchoring of people and practices, social democratic people and practices specifically in the economic field, expressed in a mode of thinking about and doing democratic politics as if it is a market. Perhaps, needless to say, this is especially significant for center-left parties because of their historical anchoring in working class constituencies, organized labor, and their claims to representing the unrepresented. So coming back to the little blue bar chart, what it shows is recent growth trends in the PR industry, of which political consultancy is a subcategory. In 2022, the combined fee income of the leading public relations agencies worldwide amounted to more than $17 billion US, up 12% from less than $15.3 billion a year earlier. PR firms in the United States alone accounted for $11.4 billion, for about 2/3 of the global, this 2022 total. So a historical note, there's a historical dimension to this project in which I trace the origins of political consultancy. I don't have time to talk about it today, but it's worth just noting that historically it actually originates in California in the 1930s in the form of anti-socialist and pro-business mobilization, adopted by the US Democratic left, especially by incumbents and powerful elites in the 1950s and the 1960s. The effect of that was that the archetypical US political consultant by the end of the 1960s came to be sort of understood as to be a democratic campaign manager or strategist. And this had the effect, I think, of erasing the origins of the profession on the conservative and pro-business and anti-social right. There's a whole history of the profession as it developed in the US that can be told in terms of this erasure. We won't talk about that today. Back to it. So there's a whole lot of literature on consultants and political strategists. For obvious reasons, it's a particular preoccupation in American political science. So what this shows you here is my own analysis of the rise of terms like spin doctor, political consultant, Republican consultant, Democratic consultant, over time between 1850 and 2019. And this quote is from political scientist Adam Scheingate. In the last 100 years, a modern political consulting industry took shape to control of American elections. There are all sorts of concerns, of course, attached to this. The political scientists have duly expressed that it's a threat to citizen voter and candidate-driven participatory democracy that generates political alienation, cynicism, and apathy, and that is a symptom of party decay and decline. At the same time, this literature has what seems to my mind, and what I think would clearly anyone who adopts a field perspective, a series of problematic tendencies. One is an indifference to cultural, aesthetic, and symbolic dimensions of democratic politics, tendency to essentialize, including relying on categorical, typological, and non-relational conceptualizations of political consultants, resort to mechanistic causality about what causes political consultants or what they cause, and aim to uncover the truth of political consultancy, what is their essence or essential meaning. A tendency to adopt a tone that's the logic of the trial, right? What are they to blame for our current democratic situation? There's also a tendency toward a micro-macro logic in which persons are merely symptoms of bigger and more important structural things. There's a tendency to presentism in which the telling of history is done through the telling of anecdotes about what this or that consultant did or a campaign that they ran, and quantitative trends. And in there, you get a sort of decontextualizing effect, ability to situate political consultants in a neoliberal context, and an underappreciation of consultancy's transnational and global scope. In short, lost my place here. In short, existing scholarship doesn't take note of, or much less account for, certain curiosities of political strategy as a vocation. For instance, okay, so this is a quote from the 1990s. The third wave period, a period of the internationalization of political consultancy, which involved a performative re-envisioning of the world's democracies as a constellation of markets that offered to American pols or politicos sites of variable profit-making opportunities. What you're looking at here is a quote taken from the magazine Campaigns and Elections, an industry publication of US political consultancy that's one of the empirical sources I'm working with. What they're saying, they're describing here, there's a lot of discussion in the 1990s about the emergent markets for political consultants on a global scale. Here they're describing markets in Southeast Asia. They note that elections in the region are becoming more competitive. There's a demand for a whole range of campaign services. There are no cash flow problems. In Japan's 1990 elections, the LDP had a budget of about 1 billion. Korea's major parties are thought to have budgets in the billions. Asian candidates and political parties have only recently begun to approach American political consultants, but observers expect the most lucrative markets to be in Korea, Japan, and Taiwan. In this mode, in the 1990s and early 2000s, consultants writing in the pages of Campaigns and Elections assessed for their peers and colleagues in the market potential of democratic arenas on a global scale. South Africa was especially promising. Latin American democracies could be lucrative, but were mostly important as training grounds. Northern and continental European political parties had competent in-house experts, but there was also a demand for the more cutting-edge and sophisticated polling and messaging techniques of American polls. European parliamentary systems were also difficult markets since televised political ads were more regulated and election funds were unfortunately controlled by party bureaucracies instead of individual politicians, campaigns, and office speakers. Newly democratic countries of Eastern Europe were promising incipient markets, but parties didn't have a lot of money to spend, so this refiguring of the world's democracies and democratizing countries as a hierarchy of more or less lucrative political markets and markets information can be read as an outward expression of an internationalizing profession in which US consultants understood themselves as titans of the global consulting industry. Some historical reference points on the profession's internationalization, which is very much led by political consultants, include the establishment of the American Association of Political Consultants, which was 1968, acquired national counterparts in the United Kingdom, the Association of Professional Political Consultants in London in 1994, a new Latin American Association of Political Consultants that was created in Buenos Aires in 1995. In 1996, there was a European counterpart, the European Association of Political Consultants, founded in Vienna. Later, you have the establishment of the Asian Political Consultant Association in 2014 in Manila. And last but not least, in 2016, the establishment of APC Africa in Johannesburg with under the leadership of Matt McMillan, the CEO of an American PR firm based in Ohio called Buzzmaker. Okay, so this is one of the curiosities. Again, we're talking here about things that you can account for in a field language that are difficult to account for with the current literature on political consultancy. Another of my favorite examples, which Stefanos has seen before, is the case of Johan Persson here, who is essentially selling austerity to his European peers in 2012 via lectures, videos, and interviews hosted by McKinsey. So here we have international terrain, a commercial political consultancy that creates an emergent transnational space of probabilities. And in this case, the carving out of a social space through which private corporations have been able to mobilize Nordic social democratic capital against itself. So person here is well, I think it kind of speaks for itself, right? When you introduce market-driven reforms in the public sector, you might end up with more productivity, but a less fair distribution. We did it. We could have done it another way. Continue discussing endlessly about how to do it, then you can be sure about one thing: the financial markets will decide, and that is a threat to democracy itself, because this is about democracy. So the reason a person is able to do this so effectively is because, as the Prime Minister of Sweden, he oversaw the liberalization of capital controls and other economic measures that transformed the famed Swedish model and brought, as he well knew, levels of inequality to Sweden unknown since the early 20th century. The most striking thing about this, of course, is the messenger himself. Another example of things that I think the field approach can allow us to recognize and conceptualize as a feature of the development of political consultancy is, this is in the early 2000s, the emergence of mutual professional esteem in a time of democratic erosion. We see things in a Bourdieusian way. Our attention is drawn to markers of global professional autonomization. That is the emergence of an internal logic among political consultants divorced from the logics of partisan opposition and democratic representation that define electoral politics. Here we have James Carville, probably one of the most famous democratic strategists in the United States, very famous by association with Clintons, talking about his admiration for infamous, you could say, Republican strategist Karl Rove in the wake of the 2004 presidential election, which we might recall was ultimately determined by a decision of the Supreme Court. So he's talking about his admiration for his professional colleague, Karl Rove. Sometimes the truth hurts. It pains me to say this, but Karl Rove is the preeminent political strategist in the US today. Every political consultant has an abiding insecurity. It's not about losing. It's about not knowing whether a winning candidate would have won without them. The question I asked myself after every winning campaign was my guy just going to win it anyway? Bush winning the presidency in 2004 was not one that he was just going to win anyway, and that's why I have to tip my hat to Rove. Rove mobilized the base. He formulated a message that avoided the fact that his candidate had positions and a record that the majority of American people disagreed with, who else ever won the presidency on a message that basically says, you may not like what I stand for, but I stand for something. President Bush won not because he was a better candidate, but because he had a better campaign. Then he ends it with, if Rove wanted to switch parties, I'd take him up on it in a second. One of the things that's so striking here is Carville's allusion of the fact that Bush did not win the election by electoral majority. He was given the presidential office by decision of the Supreme Court. This, I think, is a striking mode of seeing and interpreting political events that obviously expresses the professional investments of the vocational strategist. So, coming up to the current moment, a final example, the Hollywoodification of democratic politics, or in Bourdieu's terms, steps toward transnational unification of a profession inflected by Hollywood-style aesthetics and systems of recognition. So we have here the Poly Awards, which is now the general name for the annual meetings of the American Association of Political Consultants, named after a Saturday night award ceremony that basically has the not even the subtle aesthetics of the Oscars. Above the Poly Awards there, it says the Oscars of political advertising. So we also have more recently, and this came as a surprise to me, the establishment of the Neapolitans, which is based somewhere in Latin America, even though it has all of the iconography of Washington, D.C., and is named after the pioneer democratic political consultant Joe Napolitan, who was also instrumental in the establishment of regional and global associations of political consultants. So again, Oscar imagery. Last but not least, an extension of the same Hollywood aesthetics. You too can become a strategic expert for the low price of $10 a month by taking this master class with Democratic consultant David Axelrod, who since the 1980s worked for both Hillary and Obama and helped develop Obama's 2008 Hope and Change campaign and served in the Obama administration. And again, Mr. Rove, Republican consultant since the 1980s, former chairman of the College Republican, co-chair of the Republican National Committee, central to Bush family campaigns in the 1970s and 1980s. Also a driving force, so it's said, behind the conservative and Republican takeover of the Texas Supreme Court in 1988. And of course, George W. Bush's campaigns, first for governor and then for the president, where after winning those campaigns, he became part of the administration and played a leading role in the formulation of the Iraq War. So that one speaks for itself. So I'm just gonna leave that there. The broader point I'm trying to make in all these examples is that through a Bourdieusian mode of analysis, the rise of global political strategy as a vocation can be read as a reordering of the practices, aesthetics, and possibilities of democratic political fields in the image of a unified global market in which what is supplied is not democratic representation, but rather strategic election techniques and catchy slogans. So this is the initiative that I'm working on, a field approach to political economy, political consultancy, organized by questions that haven't been asked. So some of those questions about strategists' professional trajectories, their understandings of the world, their places in it, the contextual question of neoliberalism, the context of neoliberalism and the rise of strategy as a vocation and its relationship to democracy, internationalization, transnationalization, and globalization of the profession, when it happened, why, how, with what effects. Some of the empirics that I'm working with, in addition to the publication that I've already referenced, include industry and company profiles to kind of get to that political economy side of it, and oral histories, memoirs, and interviews, which I'm collecting. So I think I'm probably pretty close to out of time, perhaps. Good. So briefly, the last point there, the drawing on point. What I'm drawing on is my own conception of neoliberal politics as a terrain that is formally but not practically or experientially democratic or representative. I also have in mind the analysis of Josh Pasevich, whose work on ethnographic work on US Rust Belt cities identifies a core feature of the neoliberal game as the decline of party-based community leaders, and in their place, the rise of professionals touting partnership, benign mode of doing politics that prioritizes cooperation and anti-political mode of doing politics. I'm also drawing on Bourdieu's notion of professionalized politics as sites of political dispossession. That is, as a politics in which, through the production of slogans, programs, and commentary signs, agents in the political field are engaged in a labor of representation by which they seek to construct and impose a particular vision of the social world. course, in that work, Bourdieu is working on a national analysis of France in particular, in which a key dynamic is the formation and bureaucratization of political parties, not speaking of labors of representation for profit on a transnational scale. So, believe it or not, at this point, to wrap up, I'm going to come back to Bourdieu and Sayad's uprooting, and I'm going to argue that it can be reworked as a political economic concept with applications to global strategy as a vocation. Some brief background on this, referring to the work on the ECB that I've been doing with Antoine Boucher. One of the things that we draw on there is Bourdieu's reading or interpretation of Polanyi's Great Transformation as an account of how the British state, guided by mercantilist theories, built and naturalized a boundary between the economic and the domestic via the gold standard order. For Bourdieu, Polanyi's contribution was not a sociological concept of market embeddedness, but rather the state and knowledge-driven processes through which economic fields take on socially factual qualities. Bourdieu thus broke with interpretations of Polanyi as a progenitor of general ontological claims about the disembeddedness of markets, which critics have pointed out tend to leave intact, in Greta Krippner's words, a vision of the social world as sharply demarcated into neatly bounded and essentially separate realms, one that ultimately reinforces the ontology of the free market. Concept of uprooting, the concept of uprooting offers an alternative to embeddedness or disembeddedness of the dominant concept, so that's the thing I'm going to add here. I don't think there is an equivalence between colonial oppression and contemporary marketized democratic politics. But uprooting is nonetheless a transferable concept that's helpful for thinking critically about the character and implications of democratic arenas refigured via globalized professional consultants and consultancies in the image of the market. Indeed, there are striking parallels between Bourdieu and Sayad's account of the dynamics of uprooting in colonial Algeria and neoliberal politics. For Bourdieu and Sayad, the resettlement camp is a hybrid constellation that recombines external social logics and internal pressures to disculture its residents, prepare them for city living while effectively denying them access to it. This gives rise to a series of contradictions, including the phenomenon of town dwellers without a town. We state this with only minor modifications to characterize neoliberal politics. Neoliberal political arenas, refigured in the image of the market, are hybrid constellations that recombine external social logics and internal pressures to dispoliticize citizens and voters, preparing them for democracy while effectively denying them access to it, giving rise to democracy without a demos. So I'll end with a preliminary definition of uprooted democracy, a working hypothesis as I move forward with this work. So the definition: a denationalized politics that is dominated by multinational corporations, that is, by capital, and is grounded in non-party centered networks in which culturally, historically specific political knowledge is considered irrelevant or unnecessary, favoring instead homogenized political language, aesthetics, and analytical techniques that are inextricably linked with the market conception of democratic politics. Thank you.
And now there's something completely different. And I do apologize for the kind of mental gymnastics and cognitive U-turns you'd have to do right now. If I knew it, maybe I would have changed something. So this is going to be a very different talk than the other two. It's not about fields, it's about trust. I don't, as far as I know, I don't think Bourdieu wrote about trust, but there are experts here who know better than me that I'm happy to be corrected later. So I might appear as a bit of an interloper here, the sort of person who barges on other people's conversations and tries to change, the topic to my favorite topic. But there's a connection here, though somewhat tenuous. More than 10 years ago, I wrote a paper, a little provocation called Spaces Between Fields. I argued that the concept of field is indeed a rigorous application of the relational approach, apart from the distinction between fields themselves. Inside fields, all entities are dissolved into bundles of relations. But what makes a field economic and another literary tends to remain at the level of proper names. And And I suggested that a rigorous application of the relational approach would require us to imagine that there are spaces between fields, zones where what seems to be clearly separate, economic from the domestic, for example, are constantly entangled with one another and then constantly separated. My inspiration, in fact, was Bourdieu's own analysis of the twofold truth of the gift. And that's the connection. So the inspiration of this talk as well, to the way I try to think about trust as well, is the twofold truth of the gift. So the following set of thoughts began from an empirical puzzle. In 2022, we conducted a survey among long COVID patients. As is common in trust surveys, we asked them to rank on a scale of 1 to 5, how much they trust various sources of information. As you can see, the second most trusted source is my doctor. So far, so good. But at the end of the survey, we also asked respondents to describe in a few short sentences the experience of obtaining medical treatment for long COVID. And 79% of the respondents reported negative and frustrating encounters with doctors. One of the most common verbs they use was being gaslit by doctors. Now, it is a rule of human experience that we complain more than we praise, but nonetheless, I think, to my mind, it's inescapable that the same people who ranked my doctor as highly trusted also complain bitterly about being gaslit by doctors. And this small discrepancy made me doubt whether we know what we are doing, what we are measuring when we ask people in a survey how much they trust. And it also, to me, indicated some profound conceptual problems with not only the enterprise of measuring trust, but with the sociological theory of trust. So to foreshadow the overall structure of the argument, even the most methodologically rigorous sociological surveys of trust, and mine wasn't, suffer from what Bourdieu would have called the common sense fallacy. But by the same token, the most sophisticated sociological theories of trust that I know would suffer from a scholastic fallacy. And only once we go through both fallacies can we emerge on the other side with a reconstructed theory of trusting a skilled action, something that I think Bourdieu would have called strategy, as opposed to rules. So for reasons of time, I'm going to really abbreviate the discussion of trust surveys. Suffice it to say that the common sense fallacy consists in taking this word trust from ordinary language and treating it as a scientific object. Typically, this means that trust is conceptualized as a subjective attitude of an individual trustor, resting in some quasi-rational assessment of the trustworthiness of a trustee. To know if trust exists and how much, we just need to ask them, need them to look inside and sort of figure out, the subjective sense. Now, the paper on which this talk is based points out numerous problems with this approach. For example, what people say may be very different from what they do. So people may say in an answer to a survey that they have zero trust in government scientists. And yet every morning, like their morning prayer, they will count their pills and they will take them, the pills that were approved by government scientists at the FDA, which should count as a true level of trust. Answers to survey change over time. Behavior, a lot slower to change, but is it trust? So I'll spare you the tedious details. The important point is that those problems with surveys, and that's just a matter of critique, it can be treated as empirical evidence about trusting as practical action. We learned that trust is highly dependent on context, that mistrust is not the opposite of trust, that trust is not a monotonic function, but asymmetrical and eventful. Now, all of this should be of greatest relevance to sociologists because trust is a necessary assumption in almost every sociological theory and every sociological explanation. The vast literature on social capital, for example, rests on the implicit assumption that trust can be accumulated and stored. I'm not sure about that at all. Mistrust, I'm sure, can be accumulated, stored, and used for further purposes. Trust, I'm not sure at all, precisely because of this asymmetrical nature of it and eventfulness. So a lot of sociology rests on shaky ground as long as we not clarify what we mean by trust and how it can be observed. Now, many social theorists have tried their hands at this. Simmel, Luhmann, Giddens, Guido Mollering, Piotr Stomka. But all their attempts lead to the same peculiar impasse. The term trust contains within itself an opposition between two different meanings. Trust as a weak form of inductive knowledge, as Simmel says, being based on some informed anticipation. And trust as routinized, tacit, requiring no unnecessary expenditure of consciousness, as Luhmann says. When stretched too far, either contrary meaning ceases to be trust and becomes its opposite. The more informed and vigilant one trust is, the more it looks like either rational prediction or mistrust. The more tacit and routinized one trust is, the more it seems like blind faith rather than authentic trust. Just when sociologists think they've pinned down this basic fact of social life, it slips their grasp and becomes something else. We would be completely at a loss of how to deal with this slipperiness if we had not had Bourdieu's analysis of gift giving. Gift too contains within itself two opposite meanings, two contrary meanings, generosity and exchange, which when pushed to their extremes, each ceases to be gift giving and becomes something else. Maximization of profit, economic exchange, charity, self-sacrifice, etc. It is possible, therefore, to use Bourdieu's analysis of the twofold nature of the gift as a template for thinking about the twofold nature of trust. The first point is to get rid of this common sense word, trust. There is no trust. There's only trusting as a practice. All this talk about trust as a glue that holds society together is a figment of the scholastic imagination. What we should be studying is skilled action. Gift giving or trusting. It may seem strange to call trusting skilled action, but I would argue that this is simply because the skills involved are automated and backgrounded. So as long as they are supported by pre-existing social arrangements, frames, they remain tacit. Just like the frame that is provided by the highway allows driving to become automated to the point that drivers, lose track of time. But outside these frames, it is possible to observe the skills, which is what I intend to do with the case of long COVID patients who are dealing with an unstructured situation rife with radical uncertainty. Now, study the logic of practice means that the sociologist does not try to resolve theoretically what for the actors is a matter of practical sense and honed skill. All the aforementioned social theorists drew some distinction between trust itself, as they put it, and things that look like trust but are not. Some, like Luhmann, distinguished real trust, which involves some evaluation of risk, from mere confidence that involved no forethought. Others, like Simmel or Mollering, take the opposite tack. This is gorgeous, right? In Simmel or in Mollering, trust is a leap of faith, like Abraham in Kierkegaard's interpretation. While the reasons that people may provide to why they trust are just post hoc rationalization. They're not trust itself. This is because any reasons you could come up with can be countered by other, even better reasons for why you shouldn't trust. And so the game of reasons and counter-reasoning is an infinite regress. So when people trust, according to this view, they must have taken some leap of faith. We should avoid this tendency to draw boundaries around something that we call trust itself. This is an example of the scholastic fallacy, which attempts to predetermine in theory what actors, far more skilled than the theorists, balance and navigate in practice. We should rather think of trusting as a process that involves all its antonyms and synonyms as moments. Mistrust, skepticism, confidence, reason, anticipation, blind faith, they're all necessary moments in the process of trusting. It's impossible to trust without them, just as it is possible to give gifts without having some calculation in mind. But skilled actors know how to frame and limit the significance of this moment so as to accomplish trusting as accountably responsible. Neither blind faith, a sort of unfounded trust that would characterize them as unreliable, nor debilitating mistrust. And these are not ontological or conceptual lines between trust itself and other things. These are socially consequential distinctions that people work hard to discover in the details of practical situations. What kind of a theory would we be developing if ex ante it declared all skilled, practiced, linguistically mediated efforts to be futile, ultimately just a leap? The third point is that like gift giving, the skills involved in trusting are fundamentally about attention to temporality, about a feel for correct timing. As Bourdieu argued, it is the lapse of time between the gift and the counter-gift that makes it possible to mask contradiction between the experienced truth of the gift as a generous act and the truth that emerges from the model, which makes it a stage in the relationship of exchange. The theorists of trust told us that trust is really a leap of faith because nobody has enough time to go through the infinite regress of all those reasons and counter-reasons. This was a profound mistake. The point is rather that actors accomplish trusting as accountably responsible precisely by attending to and manipulating temporal variables. In this sense, trust is like music, like playing the piano. Even when all the same notes are played, the difference between a masterful performance and a cacophony depends on timing, sequence, speed, and duration. For example, we judge trust given too quickly to be blind faith. But we also feel that taking too long, scrutinize, the trustee, might be taken to be mistrust rather than trust. This is why trusting is eventful, non-monotonic, and asymmetrical. A single event, if out of sequence or out of tempo, can produce discord, profound mistrust. As the well-known adage goes, trust takes years to build, seconds to destroy, and an eternity to regain. That's what I mean by asymmetry. The fourth and final point is that the effort to understand trusting requires a corresponding effort to objectify the scholastic point of view, as Bourdieu would say. Now, etymology takes us back to Scholi. It means leisure, free time. The leisure of the scholar includes the privilege of stopping time in its tracks in order to construct a reversible model of the action. This model shows that gift giving is really exchange, or that trusting is really a leap of faith into the unknown. Stopping time in its tracks, the theorists can follow all the reverse path of the decision tree, counter all the good reasons with equally good reasons, and conclude that those reasons are only weakly related to trust itself, which must be a leap of faith. This reflects a point of view that is outside the action, a point of view which has all the time in the world to show that the actors couldn't possibly have the time to actually weigh all the reasons and to trust reasonably. Therefore, it must be a leap of faith. The mark of the scholastic policy, says Bourdieu, is that the theory treats the point of view of the actors as an obstacle to be destroyed and not as an object to be understood. This can be easily demonstrated by noting that however accurate and insightful is the theoretical model, the actors could never take it as a basis for their action. If a recipient of a gift acted on the truth that emerges from the model and immediately offered a counter gift, she would have insulted the other party and destroyed the whole delicate dance of gift giving. Similarly, however insightful the recognition that trust ultimately involves a leap of faith, the actors cannot take it as a basis for their action, for if they do, they would appear to everybody, including themselves, as placing blind faith rather than trust. The problem for the sociologist is not to decide by definition of fiat which of those truths, the truth of the model or the truth of the actor's point of view, is the real one, but as Bourdieu says, to hold them both together so as to integrate them. First step in this direction is to direct sociological attention to the mechanisms by which the actors themselves are able to hold on to both truths at once. In the case of the gift, it is the lapse of time between the gift and the counter gift. It is the actor's practical sense of timing and the institutionalized temporal frames that organize which time horizon is foregrounded. In the case of trusting, we need to turn our attention to the mechanisms that the actors employ to manage the contradiction between the subjective experience of trust as well-founded and the scholastic demonstration that trust is an absurd leap of faith. Actors are in fact aware of this tension, and they may refer to it obliquely through forms of gallows humor. In an homage to ethnomethodology, I call the mechanism they employ trust methods. These are practical devices they employ to accomplish trusting as accountably responsible. And I'd like to end, at the end will take a while.
You have a bit of time.
I have a bit of time here. By illustrating some of these arguments, drawing on interviews with long COVID patients. So remember that the survey respondents ranked my doctor as the second most trusted, but my own research was the most trusted, number one. So we interviewed them and we asked them why. And as they answered, it became clear immediately that they were keenly aware, the question provoked, of the moral panic about people who believe everything they read on the internet, right? And they were very concerned to distance themselves from this image. So when asked if they worry about online misinformation, interviewees said they worry about the general public, not about themselves, because they had, employed multiple checks and cross-references. They said things like, I get at least 3 or 4 other sources that are related to each other. It's from a journal. I check out the journal, who owns it, et cetera, et cetera. In short, as interviewees described how they conducted online research, they were concerned to present themselves as different from the general public, who in their depiction believed everything they read online. They drew a contrast between blind faith and blind faith in online information, or even in what just patients, quote unquote, said, and their own responsible trust bolstered by elaborate set of checks. And I think it's useful to hear this because it's a good correction to media depictions of ordinary people as fools who believe everything that they read online. And it also shows that trusting involves drawing a distinction between blind faith and responsible trust. But this is not what I mean by trust method or trusting a skilled action. How to trust responsibly is not given in advance. It's not a script, but it must be discovered in the details of the situation. Trust methods are not scripts in the way that our interviewees self-confidently depicted them, but situated practices of looking and telling, as Howard Garfinkel would say. And it is a continuous task, an endless, ongoing contingent accomplishment. One of our interviewees, for example, was an ICU nurse, said that she would trust online information only if she could trace it to a prestigious outlet like JAMA, like the Journal of the American Medical Association. What would happen if in JAMA there was another article that completely contradicted the one she read? In fact, there's another, which one should she trust? As another interviewee commented, it's hard to know when they contradict each other, especially when some of the sources that contradict each other are pretty good. She could read further and follow the citation trail, but she might discover very quickly many other unresolved disputes. So the scripts don't work. It's not the scripts that allow you to trust. One of our interviewees summed up this experience aptly. She says, and so they send you down, the research rabbit holes, reading as much as you can. But that was really, really a big one for me because it was something I could have hung on. So by research rabbit hole, she means the theory that long COVID is caused by activation of the dormant Epstein-Barr virus, EBV. Now, because this interviewee was infected with mono when she was an adolescent, he thought this theory could be true and apply to her. However, the theory remains, to this day, highly contested. There's no agreement about it. Many studies didn't find links between the two illnesses. Some studies did find. To the interviewee that was not unprepared to delve into the debate, he had an undergraduate degree. Her husband was, the chief of the Eyal department in the local hospital. However, there was a reason for concern. Wouldn't she appear as one of those people who believe everything, they read on the internet just because it applies to her? Then she joined a Facebook group for long COVID patients. In the group, she interacted with several women who, like her, were middle-aged, had long COVID, and had mono as adolescents. Now, this is what she means by something I could have hung on to. It is equivalent to asking rhetorically, what are the chances that there would be this kind of coincidence? Once she felt reassured that to trust this theory would not be blind faith, she asked the doctor to test her for EBV. The test returned positive and showed off-the-charts signs of the virus. Now, the story is instructive for the following reasons. The expression research rabbit holes bears striking similarity to what the theorists of trust identified as the infinite regression of reasons and counter-reasons that preclude explaining trusting by reference to any decisive ground. This means that the scripts that our respondents so confidently presented must be seen as only the thin outer layer of the trust methods. And trust methods are indeed sedimented. They are organized in several superposed layers that an experienced interviewer must probe, because the real problem with trust methods is not trust or not to trust. You always have to trust eventually. But how to stop the descent into infinite regression, whether it is a research rabbit hole or deciding whether other patients are like me and I can trust them. As a result, in any given situation, it's likely you find several devices linked together. Now, the interviewee said that she needed something I could have hung on to. The imagery is not of a leap of faith. The imagery is of an anchor, something solid, solid enough to stop the spiral. Her use of the conditional could have indicates that she's reflexively aware that this is not a solid ground. Yet it is a big one, as she puts it. Namely, it's not arbitrary. It makes sense of a present situation. It allows her to proceed. It is defensible by asking rhetorically, what are the chances? In short, the problem is not just how to stop the descent into the rabbit hole, but how to do this and yet trust responsibly. Individuals need to discover in the details of the situation the means for doing so. Now, the big one for the interviewee was the encounter with patients like her, who shared her symptoms, her social position, her illness trajectory, etc. Now, this can be interpreted as a simple tribal rule. Trust people who are the same as you. Only trust it. But this interpretation ignores the fact that who is a patient like me is not obvious. When reading other patients' descriptions of their symptoms and what worked for them, it is not obvious how to determine which ones are the same and which were applicable because patients' reports contradict one another. As you hear, there's a lot of noise out there in the long COVID space. It's hard to know who to trust. You just read all these reports, but you're not sure who's reliable. This is the same problem as with research rabbit hole. It's essentially the same problem. It leads to a similar search for situational details that can confirm whether one is trusting responsibly. Trusting other patients is a situated practice. It's not a ready-made script. Finally, the way this interviewee accounts for her trust relies on a particular narrative sequence. The sequence begins with reading about EBV and then proceeds through falling down the research rabbit hole, encountering other patients, discovering that they share a similar biography, and finally obtaining the confirmatory test result. If we change this sequence, the quasi-probabilistic appeal to what are the chances disappears. For example, if the sequence began with the patient's group, in which the interviewee was sent to read about EBV, the encounter with patients sharing her history would have lost its dramatic effect as a discovery. Similarly, from the point of view developed here, the test result is not objective proof, but an element that derives its value from coming at the right moment in a narrative sequence. If the test did not come at the end, it would have lost its status as a clincher, providing final confirmation. After all, since we know she had mono as an adolescent, we can expect her to still have traces of the virus in her. This is actually the fact that she had high levels of EBV is not so surprising. So I'm emphasizing all of this just to indicate that sequence was extremely important here in order to, in this case, account for to the interviewer this was responsible trust, perhaps also accounting for herself. Right.
So we have time for questions, and I was really quite struck by your opening, this sort of backing off. When in one particular way, I saw your paper as entirely complementary with Stephanie's, in the sense that one is about trying to manage the sort of basic requirements for a particular value to function, in this case, trust, if we can call it a value. I don't know if there's a more technical term.
Interesting.
Whereas in Stephanie's case, we're talking about a kind of cast of characters who are fundamentally indifferent to the value that would be essentially expected of them, but are trying to negotiate a whole series of other values, much more professionally oriented. It's also a sort of producers, in the sense brought by Johan, as opposed to kind of consumption of people essentially mistrustful of others who need to construct these alternative scenarios to operate. I don't know if this complementarity is at all useful as a way of thinking, and if you wanted to play on it, that includes Johan. Or if there's a much better way of framing it, but then it's kind of impromptu.
I mean, I can only say that you gave me like a great idea that I really should go talk to political consultants. I mean, they don't want to, they probably don't want you to interview them, but they wouldn't mind talking to me about trust. Yes.
That would be great.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea.
Was it that?
Yes, I was thinking like Stefanos that we had a whole range from the production of knowledge, the mediators, and the belief or not. And for me, so there is no use of trust in Bourdieu as such, to confiance, but there is production of belief, which encompasses all sorts. And you worked on the mistrust now for scientists. So you can see that you need these mediators that Stephanie talked about to produce the belief that politics will be better if we hire these the services of these strategists. And the other term he uses is credit. So it's in the market of symbolic. So I talked about it, and so the gift is part of this thinking about symbolic exchanges, and then it works very well with the whole issue of production of belief. Thank you for a wonderful panel.
Would you mind introducing yourself?
Ido Tavori, so I have a question for Stephanie. But I wonder a little bit about two things about this question, and these are compliments. But first is you talk about the political field, but it seems to me like a lot of the action is happening also in the advertising. And what's the relationship between what's happening in the advertising field and what's happening in the political field? Because you have a lot of, you have agencies where you don't even know which one is it. Or something very different. I interviewed people in SSMK. SSMK is this. What part of them are? So I'm wondering how you think about the relationship between fields. And this also raises another question, and maybe that's actually related to the question of trust, because especially in advertising, the basic truth of advertising, basically, the kind of old Michael Schutzen kind of point is that nobody actually knows if it works. and that the real correlation is between firms that succeed or products, brands that succeed, and then they get advertising, not from advertising to brands that succeed. Now, there's kind of like with online advertising, there's been some movement on that, but I wonder if these kind of questions are also questions that the people you study kind of constantly have to deal with as a practical matter, and how do they deal with that?
So on the question of the relationship between political field and advertising, that is incredibly important for the story of the formation of the profession. You know, it's the first political consultancy was in the California consultancy that I referred to, which is called Campaigns Inc., and eventually became Whitaker and Baxter. The folks who established it had their own sort of newspaper wire service, but were hired in 1934 to try and prevent the socialist candidacy of Upton Sinclair from successfully winning the election for the governor of California. And the money behind that was Hollywood. It was Hollywood and advertisers, like commercial advertisers, were kind of involved in that. And as it sort of becomes as consultancy becomes something that's adopted on the Democratic side, it's linked to Madison Avenue. It's linked to commercial advertising and the big Madison Avenue firms. And part of what's motivating that is the desire of incumbents, basically to keep challengers at bay from within their own party. Basically, they're able to mobilize the sort of wealth and power of commercial advertising in order to prevent them from challenging them in primaries. So I think there's an important historical relationship between the development of advertising, commercial advertising, and the development of and they're sort of symbiotic, I think. And that symbiosis extends to the development of technologies and new technologies of communication, right, which are so important for the development of advertising. And one of the things that I think is interesting about that is that it's a logic of doing politics that is actually fundamentally opposed to a socialist or social democratic logic of doing politics. And so it's not surprising then that that's something that's mobilized first on the right, and why it's troubling to me that it's something that gets done. So that's a little bit of a circuitous answer, but the long and short of it is that it's something I'm thinking about a lot, that I think is part of the story of the sort of historical development of this consultancy, political consultancy as a first sort of a uniquely sort of California animal, actually, that's sort of related to the weakness of political parties in California, the scale of the state, the constant referenda and elections and things, and it made it hard for business interests essentially to conduct politics the way they wanted to. And so I think it kind of starts there, and then there's a story to be told then about how the kind of ways that consultancy mobilizes media became an unavoidable way of campaigning in the U.S. on basically, and it kind of starts to saturate and permeate all levels of politics in the U.S. By the time you get to the 1970s or so. And then there's a story then of how consultancies are linked. This political economy story I mentioned of how they're sort of linked into the development of multinational corporations, right? Which is part of what I think gives it this, like, consultancy in general is sort of this amorphous thing that I think you were referring to, where exactly what consultancy does, right? It's sort of like 1 minute they're working on figuring out marketing for a product, another minute they're figuring out an election campaign, the other minute they're figuring out how to advise people on geopolitical risk, it's just kind of, and I think that has to do with the development of multinationals and the way in which they kind of gobble up consultancies that are otherwise relatively small operations, and then successful, meaning lucrative, then they get eaten by these larger consultancies. So I think that's part of the story. On the question of trust, I think that is probably one of the most fundamental dilemmas of the political consultant, right? And that's what Carville is talking about, right? How do you know that it was you, right? And so what is and so why is that important? That's important because political consultants they develop a clientele, by being able to document their successes, which is basically important to decisively show, right? And especially as they go abroad, what they do when they go to Sweden. Karl Rove went to Sweden in the 1980s. Is they tally up all of their successes, right, as proof. Which is, of course, a selective thing, because what they do is they say, we've been involved in the winning campaigns of 38 prime ministers and blah, 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 and they don't tally up the losing campaigns, right? So it is, I guess there is a sense in which that's very much related to the sort of the dynamics of trust that Gil is talking about. Anyway, that was extremely long. Thank you.
Okay. I find your study fascinating, and I think it's a really compelling story you're telling about kind of consultants that are linked to neoliberal politics. But I can just as kind of thought experiment, I can imagine, or what I've read, Bernie Sanders had his political consultants, AOC, kind of her own consultant, but she brought in people, Elizabeth Warren. I think you could tell a story too about a kind of political consulting being mobilized for left progressive politics. So, I'm just wondering how you're going to factor that into your analysis, because I don't think the whole field, it is, I'm sure, dominated by these global firms and people working for more neoliberal candidates, but there's some portion of that field, I think that's being mobilized for different kinds of politics. Yeah, I guess it's a question. How's that kind of factoring?
That's one of the purposes of the interviewing and memoir side of this is to disaggregate, right, and to kind of establish the sort of this space of positions, right, and contention within the world of political consultancy, so it becomes almost at a certain point, it becomes, like I was saying before, sort of an obligation to have a consultant, right? You can't be considered to have a serious campaign, right, if you don't have a consultant. And it's a subject of contention within the Democratic Party. The DNC at one point, basically in a move that clearly meant to sort of disadvantage, left progressive challengers to mainstream Democrats, at one point forbids, it says, we won't work with a consultancy that works with a candidate that is trying to challenge a sitting Democrat in a primary, right? And so they're basically like, mobilizing, the commercial interests of consultancy in order to undermine, challengers that are sort of to the left of the Democratic. So, so there's a politics of consultants and around consultancy that's very much a live concern. And it's something, so how do you do a Sanders style consultancy, right? How do you run a Sanders style campaign? On the one hand, I think my sense so far from talking to people is that there's very clear explicit thinking about that problem, right? On the other hand, there's this sort of force of conformity that you get from the generalized world of sort of consultancy-driven, flashy campaigning, right? It's one of the reasons I'm interested in aesthetics. On the one hand, Sanders is obviously, a candidate of a very different kind, right, relative to, I don't know, a Clinton. But the aesthetics of the campaign, right, are actually, if you look at like campaign websites, if you look at language, if you look at the sort of ritualistic way in which you move through a campaign website, you go to it first, and then something pops up that says donate now, right? And you have to go through that in order to then actually get, it reads as basically no different in an aesthetic sense from the campaign website of a I don't know, Trump, Republican. So I think that's a, so there's a sort of set of dilemmas in there that are part of what I would sort of understand, right? And understand sort of some of the sort of critical arguments that are taking place within the world of consultants, many of whom are young people, right? Who come to DC, right? And their campaign, they work on a campaign, the campaign fails, so they don't get a job after the campaign, they go into consultancy. And so that's that sort of reflexive discussion about how to do politics differently in a way that doesn't sort of work against, the sort of the politics of someone like Bernie Sanders is something that I want to hear from them about.
Yeah, I have a question with the two. It's going to start with a question to you, but I think it's for both. So one thing that, I mean, I really love the paper and I'm waiting for the book. But one thing that I was missing, and I'm sure will be in the book, is the techniques, the technologies used and their effect on the story that you're telling. The reason why I thought about it is that as you were finishing the story, I was thinking, isn't this the end of this story? Because now, reminded me, he said, advertisers, you don't know. And Don McKenzie was here, just a few months ago, and with all the algorithms being used, they still don't know. But obviously, I mean, political consultancy has been transformed in the last few years through these new techniques. So, and I thought, some spin doctors are gurus, but some of them are pollsters, some of them run focus groups, they have different techniques. So this question also applies in the sense that there is some opposition in the intellectual field that we exist in between the study of technologies and Bourdieuian field theory, Bourdieuian analysis. You talked indeed about the way in which all those principles that you need for the study of ideas, intellectual history, etc., are there in field theory. But what about the techniques, technologies? Their role is it something that you find enough resources in field theory, or something that you need maybe to look outside as well?
Well, I think it depends a little bit on the research question you're asking, right? I think the critical point of field theory is that you have a sort of systematic model to link properties of intellectual products to producers to conditions. And so when you look more specifically into these production, technological products, devices, and so on. And I don't see any principal problem by paying attention to this, integrating it, and so on. I have a question for you. So very interesting talk, but you didn't, when you talk about trust, one question which immediately comes up is, what is being trusted by whom? And so, for example, what is being trusted? I think there's some pretty good research showing that there are two factors that are well known to have a strongly declining effect on trust. One is conflict of interest. Medical world is chronic. It's a huge problem with trusting medical information, medical expertise, and so forth. The second aspect, which also immediately has a declining effect on trust, is a controversy. Whenever there is a sort of public controversy about knowledge or information, so trust declines very, very rapidly. Right? So on the one hand, there's what is being trusted, has certain properties and so forth, to which you should pay attention, I suppose. On the other side, there are the people who trust what. And there the social variations, I suppose they related to, cultural capital and so forth. So I wonder how you integrate these two.
Stephanie first, and then.
Oh, right. So I think the question of technique linked, I think, to the question of advertising and communication technologies, and I think it's I have kind of a working historical idea about one of the things that happens, which is linked to the advent of personal personalized polling on a campaign is that, and it actually goes back also to the question of sort of establishing sort of the truth of whether, you're a successful consultant, is this, this ability to quantify what the electorate wants, right? The ability to be able to quickly, and in the space of a campaign, to quickly respond to something by doing these quick polls, right, week by week, in order to kind of constantly adjust messaging. And so one of the things that I think emerges out of that is and this starts quite some time ago. But it's just sort of this political adaptation of like general polling, survey kind of. And so I think what emerges out of that is that part of the sort of valor attached to being a successful consultant hinges on their ability to quantify, right, to express quantitatively what the electorate wants or what a particular subgroup within the electorate wants. That quantification then, when you get into the digital age, there's sort of this new generation then of people who are basically saying, we can quantify better than you, right?
Yeah.
We can individually represent the particular way that this person with this specific, consumption history will respond to this particular message. And we can change the message when we knock on one person's door versus the next person's door based on what we know, right? And so there's this move that I think is an important part of the story, which is from this initial sort of settling on quantification as the main way of doing political strategy. And then a sort of successive waves of like generations of people making claims to being able to do it ever better, right? And all in the name of if you hear them talk about what they do, the point is representative democracy, right? They understand themselves to be facilitating, right, political communication.
But what about Cambridge Analytica?
Yeah.
Now, when you talk about technology, here's an example of new technology, sort of singularizing the voters and grouping them together in profiles, then have these very sophisticated campaigns in a very anti-democratic sense.
Yeah, well, and that's part of the debate over ethics, I think, that's internal to the profession and as it drives the establishment of these associations, actually is an awareness from some consultants that sort of it's potentially sort of dangerous what they're doing. It's potentially corrupt. It's potentially something that can be used, right, to manipulate and undermine democracy rather than, facilitating it. And so there's this, so they try to develop sort of methods of internally policing, right? Ethical, like developing codes of ethics, right? And so my guess is that the folks from Cambridge Analytica are not members of the American Association of Political Consultants. And that's, so that's another dimension of it.
So what is being trusted and trust? So what is being trusted? I always love this story. I always tell it. When GMO first came into existence, Monsanto did a survey in the UK, late 1980s. They asked, maybe early 1900s. They asked people, would you trust it? Would you eat it? And Brits in general said yes. A few months later, they did the same survey, but they said the British government recommends that these things are safe and you can eat them. And Brits said no. We do not trust them. Now, the reason why I love this story, but it says a couple things. It says, first of all, it shows that the trust and mistrust have an infectious quality, right? The British government is mistrusted, and that infects
Exactly.
GMOs. I mean, it was after mad cow and all of that. But it shows more than that to my mind. So I said, individuals need to discover in the details of the situation how to trust responsibly. Also, they need to discover what or who is the trustee, right? It's not a given. That's why surveys are so problematic. The survey says, do you trust GMOs? You say yes. Then it says to you, it's the British government that gives you GMO. You say, I don't trust GMO, right? So and even in situations of conflict of interest and controversy, people can discover, what is it that they would trust and what is it that they don't. one of the reasons why they say in the survey, I trust my doctor, is because they sketch into the question an image of this benevolent elderly person with a stethoscope that I would, trust, something like that, right? But obviously I can revise the question and get a different answer. So this question of who or what you trust is something that actually it's part of those trust methods. It's part of the ways, you reconcile it. Now, who trusts? This is the part I didn't talk about. I mean, my survey is not useful for that purpose. It's not representative. We were severely limited by several factors. One factor is that the phenomenon of long COVID, when we were studying it, is self-selected. People who appear as having long COVID are people who fought to get long COVID, They fought to get recognition that this is what they have. And by definition, therefore, they had more resources, they had more education, and they were women, because women, not believed by their doctors. But there's another reason why I'm sort of staying away from this. Is I said, you need to objectify the scholastic point of view. You need to understand how the actors hold this together. This is the first step. Right? The first step is you understand the mechanism by which the actors that you study are able to hold those two together. Then you ask, what are the conditions for those mechanisms? I think we discussed this in the previous session when we talked about performances and the conditions for performance. Yes, no, it's not. This research is not completed without actually starting to look also. You'd need something a little bit more, with a little bit more variation than the study that I conducted, in order to start to understand, under what conditions, people draw on the gallows humor rather than, other mechanisms.
Okay, I'm going to ask one more question. I'm on paper confirming that I agree with your proposition, but I wasn't entirely sure what you were thinking of, or what, let's say, existing work or what recent work you were objecting to or you were supporting. So I wanted a little bit to ask you to say a little bit more about it. So if the prescription, I think, sounds good, nevertheless, I wasn't entirely sure where, what the target or what the point of reference was out of which you were talking.
Well, it was a very general characteristic, and what the examples would be, or the most fruitful ways to continue and so depends pretty much on assessment of the current situation in the social sciences, also in relation to humanities and so on. So I think a concrete example would be Durkheim. You have this Durkheimology literature, an enormous body of historical scholarship. But for example, it's quite pity that, for example, there are certain very important questions seen from the present to ask about Durkheim, which are not really asked. For example, there's lots of letters and this and that and so forth. There's hardly any recent study about Durkheim as a public intellectual. I think this would be interesting. All the knowledge, the erudition about Durkheim in study, used, but to ask a question which is apparently disappeared in erudite, wherein researchers. So that would be, in a much more general way, I think they're general questions. About Bourdieu, for example, also, one aspect of the Bourdieu reception is that it's tied outside of France, it's tied to translations, but there are certain things which are not translated and not even visible outside of France. For example, part of his intellectual work was running journals. He created a social science journal, which is an extremely original, important innovation in organizing scholarship, publishing scholarship, and so forth. yet it's invisible. So this is something important to look into. Talk about circulation, what circulates and what doesn't circulate. Well, there are invisible aspects of Bourdieu's work, very relevant today in thinking about how we should practice our studies. Then, well, there are other, I think, profound questions which are not really studied, not really taken up in the literature on the history and development of the science. One is, for example, a long-term perspective. There's hardly anything, very long-term perspective on social. Very, very little. So we don't really know, we don't have a real sense in this system. What happens when you lengthen the time perspective? How do you see modern social science discipline? There are conflicting versions of this, as of course those intellectual positions that say modern social science is basically terrible version of political and moral philosophy, conservative critique, which we also don't know very well. There is anti-social science intellectual tradition, which in the social sciences is not well known at all. And there should be some much more research on that. I think it would help doing social science.
No question?
More findings.
I have a question about the conceptual payoff of uprootedness versus embeddedness. I'm all for the critique of embeddedness and throwing it out the window for all I care. But I would like you to talk a little bit more about it, because I'm kind of thinking about the metaphor of embeddedness, and I think that for all its ills, it's dynamic. You can embed, disembed, and I'm thinking about the metaphor of uprootedness, and I think that once you uproot, you can't reroot, right? So what does that mean for the relationship between fields and the economy? Like I'm going with the kind of idea, and I'd like to hear more of your thinking.
I mean, what you just described is also, you see that also the debates over embeddedness, right? Right. Can you really do it? Did Polanyi really think that the market was just embedded? Or, I mean, and Polanyi uses the term like once or twice in the book. So, and in Granovetter's use of it wasn't originally based in a reading of Polanyi at all. So, all that said, I think the reason that I've actually been looking for the right term to describe, in particular, the sort of transnational dimensions of not only sort of globalization of political consultancy, but it's the way in which it's sort of anchored and understood to be owned in some ways by American political consultants, right? Who develop certain techniques that are adapted to an American context, and then they sort of package them and they bring them, for instance, to Sweden, and it doesn't, and then they talk then about, well, does it matter that you don't speak the language? Does it matter that you know nothing about Swedish political history? Does it matter that you have no investments in social democratic parties, or and this is all from this interesting publication where you can see sort of conversations about like, well, how do you deal with it when you don't speak the language? And they're like, well, that's fine. They get you a translator, no big deal. And so there's so coming back to the uprooting thing, there's this sort of almost this sort of imperial, dynamic, in that, I think this, that, and then the fact that this sort of like imperial way of thinking about, we have this superior technology for running campaigns, right? And the way they package it and export it, and the way that it gets taken up in other countries, right, that have distinctive political traditions, that have their own, cultural and political histories, that have very different parties and party systems. There's sort of a, I do think there's this way in which that and this is especially, I think that one of the cases a lot about lately has been Sweden. There's this way in which then you get this sort of what the Swedish have called an Americanization of their politics, right? And they don't just mean that as a metaphor. I don't think, I think they're basically saying like, our own parties are doing a foreign politics, right? A politics that reads as artificial, as not, as not meaningful. And so for me, the term uprooting, it sort of captures that dynamic of it.
All right. So I think it's time for us to get a drink and something to eat. Thank you all very much for your participation today. Thank you to